We're not the first people in history to watch the health of the natural world unravel. That's something we share with a lot of folks going back a very long way. Because there's been plenty of moments in history where whole civilizations have realized that if they continued on with business as usual, it would mean the end of the Earth's ability to reliably support them. And where it was understood by a majority of people that if they didn't adapt, the changing climate would take away their way of life. So, since we also happen to be in that particular pickle of standing on the brink of ecologic collapse, let's look at some of those moments in history and see what we might learn from them. What were the stressors and strategies they had for survival? What are some different paths collapse can take, and what lessons might we take away in trying to avert our own climate collapse? Here, what I wanted to do was look at some examples of how things usually break down. But what I realized was that I didn't really know enough about these parts of history, so I went looking for civilizations who faced ecologic collapse in the past, and what I've come back with are 5 shallow dives into not only the conditions that set them up for collapse, but also how they lived those pivotal moments in their history. Keep in mind that I'm not a historian, so assume everything I'm saying is well researched but not immune to mistakes. So if you're doubting something, go explore, and feel free to let me know what I've messed up. For 800 years, the Nazca people lived in the deserts of what is today Peru. And for 800 years, their environment got steadily worse. Now, I'm not saying that's entirely their fault, because it does look like there was a larger climate shift happening in the whole of Central and Andean South America at the time, with the whole region getting drier, but what they were doing wasn't exactly helping either. To feed their growing population, the Nazca were expanding their agriculture at the expense of the native wilds. In place of the deep-rooted and nitrogen-fixing warango tree, native to their coasts, for the most part they were planting short-rooted and short-lived corn. Naturally, as the trees went, so did the ecologic buffers that the wilds provided, and what was started was a centuries-long cycle of drought and flood. The drought was manageable. The Nazca learned to terrace the landscape with large stones that helped them regulate temperature and, to a certain degree, humidity. And since they had access to abundant and reliable streams of water flowing down from the Andes, they also created what became known as buquillos. Buquillos are a sort of well that instead of running vertically down into the earth, runs horizontally through a mountain. And by keeping it underground, buquillos are able to guide water straight towards agricultural land and minimize evaporation and above-ground erosion. They're a marvel of desert resilience, but they're also very labor-intensive to make. Because not only were they digging these underground channels by hand, they were also creating frequent ojos, or eyes, which are like modern-day manholes that provide frequent access to those channels. Buquillos basically gave people the ability to survive the worst of the desert droughts, but it was the flooding in the end that did them in. Because despite rains becoming less frequent, the rain that did fall fell on earth that lacked any of those deep roots capable of holding the ground together. And there came the 1-2 punch. An agriculture that kept the soil loose and bare, and rains that eroded away what little fertility they had in the desert. So their conditions continued deteriorating until a particularly intense El Niño brought flooding so intense that it basically completely wiped out their capacity for agriculture. So the Nazca were left with water, but no soil. And without the ability to grow food, they were forced to leave their lives behind and migrate farther up the mountains to where the ecologic damage they had caused hadn't yet spread. And remarkably, they survived there for another 250 years until, and here history is a bit fuzzy, because it may have been military incursions from neighbors, or that same progressive cycle of drought and erosion that followed them and caught up to them once and for all. What's clear is that the Nazca never fully managed to adapt to their circumstances, because even though their way of life looked stable for hundreds of years, there was always that damage they were doing to the land creeping in, where the very things they were doing to survive in the desert were slowly digging the foundation of their lives out from under them. And the result is that today, over 1,000 years later, the people of modern-day Nazca in Peru are still living with the ecologic consequences of their ancestors. Because it's still one of the driest places in the world, and they're still struggling to plant those huarango trees back into their original habitat. I first learned about Rapa Nui, which most people know as Easter Island, when I read Jared Diamond's Collapse about 20 years ago. And the story as I learned it went something like, in order to move those large stone heads down from the quarry to the coast, the people of Rapa Nui brought their little island to a complete ecologic collapse. They cut every last tree on the island because they didn't quite understand their ecologic limits, and the result of their choices was that by the time the European colonists found the island, the majority of their population had died, and those left were sickly and weak. But looking into the story of the Rapa Nui today, it seems that story's evolved a bit, because a bunch of new evidence is making it look like the Rapa Nui were actually a model of resilience and adaptation, who might have begun their life on the island as an invasive species, but who over time learned how to coexist, to the point that for hundreds of years, there's an argument to be made that it was their way of life that was holding collapse back. And only when circumstances beyond their control came into play was the island finally pushed over the edge. Now, they did lose their palm tree, not just because they lacked ecologic consideration, but because there was a combination of a few different pressures. There was, of course, the felling of palm trees for things like canoes and houses, but there was also an invasive rat who loved nibbling on the palm nuts and the harsh ecologic reality of life in the South Pacific. And when you put all of those things together, it created a situation in which the palm couldn't be replenished. But while those disturbances proved to be too much for the palm tree, it wasn't too much for life on the island, because despite discovering an island more remote than most, with poor soil, latitude, and fishing, despite the original inhabitants destroying the habitat of most every native bird and lizard, and in spite of a larger shift in global climate leading to drought on the island, the Rapa Nui continued to adapt and thrive. It's looking like they didn't just erode their soil and harm their ecosystems. To respond to that, they also created a unique agriculture suited to the harsh island conditions. At huge effort, they managed to move hundreds of thousands of stones down from the quarries into the fields, which they then used to make gardens that would regulate temperature, humidity, prevent erosion, and limit evaporation from crosswinds. And what did them in the end wasn't anything the Rapa Nui did themselves, but the introduction of one invasive species too many. That species, of course, being the human being. They succumbed to a combination of Peruvian slave traders raiding the island and diseases brought by European colonists. And so, left weak and ravaged, the island was annexed by Chile, their resources put under the control of a British company, and the last 111 natives were essentially imprisoned. And without anyone left to tend to the island, to grow the sweet potatoes, yams, taro, bananas, and sugarcane that they were growing, and the Europeans brought in cattle to graze the island down, the ecology collapsed to the point where nothing more than a few grasses and invasives grow there today. The way I learned about the Great Famine of Ireland when I was in school was that there were a lot of people who relied on potatoes as their most important staple crop. They were farmers, mostly landless and poor. And when a plague blighted their potatoes for 7 years in a row, millions of Irish people went hungry. Then, getting desperate and without recourse, they left their homes and headed to the other side of the planet to search for something better. What I don't remember learning here was two things. First, how overpopulated Ireland was at the time, and second, as is usually the case when something goes awry in Irish history, how selfish the English had been. Because at the time of the famine, Ireland would have been completely capable of feeding every Irish person. There was plenty of grain, corn, and barley that could have supplemented their diet while they figured out what to do about potatoes. But instead of declaring temporary measures to halt the export of Irish food abroad and ensure that Irish food stayed in Ireland to feed Irish people who were starving, what the English government chose to save was business as usual. They determined that preserving their hands-off style of government, what we know as laissez-faire, was more important than what was happening in Ireland. They looked at the situation and decided that a free market operating outside the grasp of government intervention was more important than caring for the hungry. And so they let Irish food leave a starving island, often under armed guard. Their belief about what was correct prevented them from doing what was right. And their decisions turned a bad situation into absolute chaos and a pain that, in a lot of ways, Ireland is still recovering from. 1 million Irish people died from hunger and disease, and another 2 million emigrated abroad, never to go back home. They lived 100 years of shrinking population and a collapse of the social order. There were mass evictions, a complete shift of the countryside from subsistence agriculture to grazing agriculture, and there was a forced redistribution of land away from large landowners to the landless. And if you can use population as an indicator of health, they've never gotten back to their pre-famine population, even while England has gone from 17 million to 58 million, Wales from 1 to 3, and Scotland from 3 to 5.5. And all that came down to losing a single crop. Japan in the year 1600 was a country haunted by over a century of civil war and famine. Farmers were struggling with tired soils to produce enough to feed the armies, while daimyo were absolutely leveling forests to supply their wars and build castles. To the point where, without trees to hold the soil, landslides were becoming just a common thing on the island. It was a moment of crisis, where any other country would have gone to allies or trading partners to make up for their shortfalls and feed their people. Instead, what the shogun did was cut Japan off from the outside world and close the borders under penalty of death. And somehow, within that social and ecologic chaos, Japan did something rare in history. They managed to step up to the brink of ecologic collapse and avoid it. Locked on an island with no one to rely on, Japan had no choice but to start one of the largest ecologic restorations in history. Countless edicts came down from the shogun to address the ecologic problems. Every village would be obligated to replant their forests. A legion of forest bureaucrats were created to take charge of that regeneration. Unable to purchase what they needed abroad, farmers were ordered to craft in their spare time. Human waste became big business, where farmers would travel to cities to pay people to cart their poop away. Firewood would no longer be allowed to be freely cut from the forests, but had to be collected from coppices or branches broken off during storms. Houses started being built with standard sizes and materials so they could be reused, because recycling was becoming a way of life, with things like metal getting reused to their limits. Pots were used until the metal wore through, and then they were either welded shut or broken down to make blades or tools. It was a full and nationwide regeneration that distributed responsibility to almost every person on the island, and where they all collaborated to minimize waste, protect water, diminish energy consumption, develop sustainable fishing practices, and change their diet to accommodate agriculture. And somehow, it all worked, and their population began to rise, but crucially only to a point, because they were committed enough to living within the limits of what the island could support that they established strict population controls, and that held them at a steady 30 million people for about 200 years. And the result was that within a generation or two, the country transformed. And out of a post-Civil War where ecologic collapse was basically a certainty, they found a way to look inward and help the country spring back to life. So far, we've only looked at examples where it's easy to look back and say what should have been done, because you can see where those choices led. The Nazca obviously should have stopped cutting down trees, and the English should have fed the Irish. We know that looking back, but it's a lot harder to know what to do when you're in the thick of it. So I also want to look at an example where the future's still not written, where we're still in the middle of a story that's been going on for generations, and where we'll end up is still pretty unclear. It also happens to be the story of collapse that's closest to me, and one that's directly determined the course of my life. I'm talking about Galicia, my homeland. Galicia is a region of Spain that Portugal wears like a hat, and it's a place where we've been destabilizing the ecology for hundreds of years, and where we've dragged the land through two distinct periods of ecologic collapse. The first was one of overpopulation that led to an over-exploitation of the landscape. where the subsistence agriculture and grazing practices were gradually weakening the earth, and where there were so many of us that it was really hard to find an inch of land that wasn't under the direct influence of people. So wildlife was pushed back, soils were eroded, and the land was brought to the limit of what the land could produce. So when the rainy seasons lasted a bit too long, the soils couldn't keep up and harvests would fail. And when you paired that all up with a culture of land distribution that made sure that everyone had a little bit of land, but very few people actually had enough, the result was that over the course of 100 years, we had 3 large famines, where most of us were too poor to buy our food and we couldn't look into the wilds for famine foods. And at this point, it's interesting to look at the population growth, because although it did keep growing, it was very slow, from 1.7 million in 1850 to around 2.7 in 1950. And you might look at that and think, okay, that's actually pretty fast. They're eating, they're growing, everything's fine. Until you realize that the average number of children was as high as about 5. And that's because while 2 million people more or less stayed in Galicia, another 2 million emigrated abroad and gave me my American accent. And that's without counting all the people who moved within the country, leaving their villages and homes to go try their luck in the city. And so you went from a situation where almost every inch of land was controlled down to the detail to one of almost complete abandon. And that swing in the countryside pushed us into a second period of ecological collapse. And this one might seem a bit counterintuitive at first, because it's one marked by something that the whole world is trying to do right now, which is a massive reforestation of the whole country. In just a couple of generations, we went from something that looked like this to the 70% tree cover we have today. And that looks really good on paper, because we've sunk more carbon than anybody. But the problem is that the majority of those trees are just 2 species, pine and eucalyptus. 2 species who not only continue the legacy of degrading soil, but who create and thrive within wildfire. If you're familiar with the cycle of wildfire in Portugal, where basically the whole country burns down once a decade, then you'll know what our future looks like here. Because that pattern has been spreading progressively northward, and there is a non-zero chance that 50 years from now, this once incredibly fertile place will be uninhabitable. So, looking forward, what do? How do you respond to a situation like that? When you can see collapse coming, but you can't stop it, because the inertia of systems and historical pressures are just too complex or too large to change. Where you can see things are getting progressively worse, and where you can see that the will of the people and government isn't quite where it needs to be. And you can see where that all leads, while at the same time not being able to see the exact choices that might actually need to be made to prevent it from happening. I don't really have an answer to that question, but I know that it gives me a lot of sympathy for the Nazca, because I have to think that they believed that their massive undertakings, these buquillos, should have been enough, and they were probably surprised when those floods came and washed away their whole way of life. Either way, it's something I want to talk a bit more about in part 2. What I've taken away from learning about these collapses, and how I think that they can inform the adaptations we work towards in trying to avoid the climate collapse currently looming over our heads. Something that jumped out to me while thinking about these examples of collapse was how often collapse can seem impossible until just before it happens. It can seem like too remote a possibility until it's right on top of you. Or it happens so imperceptibly slow that no single person even notices it's happening, when in reality there's something brewing under the surface. Basically, you can see some things that are degrading the environment and adapt, but there's some things that are completely invisible. It's a risk that Jared Diamond called a failure to perceive, where an oversight can cause a fatal amount of damage, like with the Nazca maybe not understanding how large an El Niño could become, or the danger posed by relying on a single variety of potato. So I'd argue that a willingness to perceive a bit farther than we're used to can become a pretty powerful tool, especially when history is telling us that it can be harder than you expect to judge if a response to climate change is enough. Because even when we think we understand something, there's probably still facets of the problem that are hidden from view, or behaviors we simply can't anticipate, or even things we might outright know are impossible to predict, like what happens after certain tipping points are crossed. Another way collapse can happen is when natural changes in nature outpace our ability to adapt. So even though it sounds pretty obvious, we also have to be willing to adapt, again, a bit farther than we expect. Because the Nazca, Galicia, and the Rapa Nui all adapted, and for hundreds of years seemed to be okay. But none of them solved their problem in the long run. They all eventually fell to that creeping pace of change. And it seems like the only thing that allowed Japan to succeed in their adaptations was a massive and sweeping societal and ecologic change from top to bottom and then bottom to top. They made it so that in just over a generation, they didn't just change the definition of what made a good worker, but what made a good person and villager. And those changes aren't necessarily easy to instill. In Japan, there were revolts and a lot of resistance before they got to a lasting peace. Like, let's put it this way, would you be willing to shovel your neighbor's shit to save the world? Because that's what Japan did, literally and figuratively. And not only that, they paid their neighbors for the privilege. There is so much more we need to adapt than we're currently willing to adapt. Because it's probably way more than just a decarbonized future, regenerative agriculture, and a green economy. I'd argue there's going to be profound changes to be made in challenging our own values and morals. Because it's a good thing to challenge a system of limitless growth and progress that freely strips the world's skin, but it's another thing entirely to accept that we've become people who think it's natural to be able to strip the world's skin whenever it suits us. Or how that's given us a psychology where it's easy to drag our feet on larger climate adaptation. Because on some level we understand that real change, despite being better for nature, will probably make our lives more difficult. And it might even involve our neighbor's night soil. Thinking about Japan and what brought about their success, it was really tempting to attribute it immediately to their isolation and top-down approach, where the shogun, basically a dictator, comes into power and starts forcing people to regenerate nature. Because not only did it work, it ended up working spectacularly well, with most of the old forests that exist today in Japan having been planted in those first couple of decades. But the more I thought about it, the less clear it became, because it was that same isolation for the Rapa Nui that slowly chipped away at their resilience, and that same dictatorial force that in large part caused the third famine in Galicia. Because when Franco came to power, he closed us off from the world and tried instilling that same self-reliance. But what he ended up doing was aggravating a lot of the existing weaknesses that already existed in the countryside. And ultimately, what relieved a lot of Spain's problems was opening itself back up to the world. So I'd argue that what actually worked for Japan was finding a way that worked for them to internalize responsibility for the care of the landscape. Closing the borders allowed Japan to accept that there was no one coming to the rescue, and they couldn't stop until they found a way to distribute that responsibility among the entire population. The eventual response to that top-down order from the shogun was a bottom-up level of support that actually provided the legwork they needed to restore the whole island. And realistically, it's that sharing of responsibility that can open up a people to greater possibility. It's what allowed the Rapa Nui to survive for as long as they did. If you look at their stone gardens, that's not something you can do without tremendous collaboration. In fact, the estimates now are that on an island of like 3,000 people, there was a team of maybe 150 whose main focus was just moving stones. And when you lose that shared responsibility, you get things like the English standing idly by while the Irish suffer, which ended up not only weakening them both, but acted as further fuel on a fire that would eventually become the Irish War of Independence 70 years later. So I'd say that, basically, our best hope for successful adaptations usually go hand in hand with finding a way to get a majority of people to collaborate and take problems on together. I think my biggest takeaway here is that once you're facing ecological collapse, there's no guarantee of success. The ugly truth is that a lot of what happens here might come down to sheer stupid luck. Japan did some good things, but they also got lucky. They live on an ecologically privileged island with good soil and latitude. They happen to live in a place where nature was ready to forgive the ecologic damage they caused. While the Rapa Nui weren't as lucky. They happen to live in a more ecologically precarious island, where at a certain point it didn't matter what adaptations they made anymore because small past disturbances had made permanent alterations to the island that made life more difficult. A lot of what works and what doesn't can be beyond our control. At this point, the best science says that we don't know exactly what's going to happen as the climate changes. What we know is that things are going to get weird. And it might be that a lot of what determines if our adaptations work is beyond our capacity to foresee. Which I'm not bringing up to say that things are hopeless, because the better we prepare and the more seriously we take adaptation and the more careful we are to figure out what the root causes of climate change actually are, the more likely our adaptations are to help us avoid collapse. But if history is any guide, we also need to be prepared for the possibility that we start a process that requires our whole civilization hundreds of years to perfect. And even then we still fail because of something we're not noticing right now. Something we can't or even don't want to see. And I hope it's clear enough that if we really understood that the stakes here are the ecological collapse of a majority of the whole planet, we'd be taking climate change a lot more seriously than we are. And I think that leaves us with a question of how much business as usual are we willing to let slide before we start taking adaptation seriously?